History's verdict. Roosevelt. On the 5th of November 1940, while most of Europe was controlled by anti-democratic dictators, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt overwhelmingly won an unprecedented third landslide victory with a massive 429 electoral college votes to his opponent's 51. On that historic day, an ecstatic crowd listened intently as the president proclaimed, "We are facing difficult days in this country, but I think you will find me in the future just the same Franklin Roosevelt you have known a great many years." Roosevelt had successfully defeated the popular anti-war platform of Wendell Willkie, who had presented Roosevelt as a warmonger. In response, just 6 days earlier, he had sought to allay the fears of a concerned American public by pledging, "Your boys and girls are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." Just over a year later, however, and despite these assurances from their beloved president, the sons and daughters of America would be sent off to fight in yet another foreign war. With a fiercely isolationist US Congress, how could this be? Even more surprisingly, Roosevelt's firmly capitalist and fervently anti-imperialist government would be allied not only to Great Britain and her vast empire, but also, almost unbelievably, to Communist Russia's colossal union of Soviet Socialist republics. This was a very different Roosevelt to the one that Americans had known as their savior from the Great Depression, the father-like figure who, through his fireside chats on the radio, had comforted Americans in their very own homes during the darkest days of the Depression. This selfsame paternal president would now lead Americans far from the sanctuary of home to distant, hostile lands and into the most destructive war the world had ever seen. There has always been much speculation about Roosevelt's true motivations. Some claim he had always planned for US intervention in order to help counter the Nazi threat to the free world. His response to a journalist during the election campaign is perhaps most revealing about Roosevelt's hidden agenda. "Of course we'll fight if we're attacked. If somebody attacks us, then it isn't a foreign war, is it? Or do they want me to guarantee that our troops will be sent into battle only in the event of another civil war?" After the horrors of World War I, the vast majority of Americans had revealed their disdain for further involvement in European problems. They had rejected President Woodrow Wilson's plans to involve the USA in a League of Nations, committed to the safeguarding of international peace. Throughout the Roaring '20s, most Americans were too preoccupied with having a good time and taking advantage of the booming post-war economy to even begin to consider European affairs. However, a decade later, the future did not look quite so rosy. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the economic depression that followed caused untold misery for millions, not just in America, but throughout the entire world. In such conditions of severe hardship, frustration with democracy began to set in, and people looked to the relatively new forms of extreme politics for the promise of quick solutions to their problems. In particular, the rise of fascism, along with its uncompromising demands for arms and empire, made many Americans uneasy that Europe may well plunge into another great war. More disconcerting still was the prospect that it would be their beloved Uncle Sam who would be called upon, once again, to save Europe from cataclysm. The Nye Committee had been commissioned in 1934 to investigate the causes of World War I. Its principal conclusion was that the lobbying of arms manufacturers had been largely responsible for war, due to their eagerness to reap huge profits through sales of armaments. In a bid to avoid the same mistakes in the future, Congress enforced a series of neutrality acts upon President Roosevelt. In 1935, an arms embargo was placed on all nations at war. In 1936, the provision of loans was prohibited to belligerents. And in 1937, US citizens were banned from traveling on the ships of warring nations. Clearly, the sinking of the passenger ship the Lusitania, which had dragged America into World War I, was still all too fresh in the minds of the many isolationists in Congress. Congressman Lewis Ludlow even attempted to introduce a constitutional amendment that would require a referendum before the president could declare war. The bill was narrowly defeated, but only by a margin of 209 to 188 in the House. If Roosevelt did plan to take the United States to war, with this level of opposition to intervention within US politics and society at large, it was certainly not going to be easy. By the time of Roosevelt's re-election in 1940, he was becoming increasingly concerned about the desperate situation of the Allies in Europe, who appeared utterly incapable of halting the terrifying Nazi blitzkrieg tactics of lightning war. Events in June 1940 appeared to stack the odds in Hitler's favor. The supposedly resilient European powerhouse France had been almost effortlessly brushed aside by the German Panzer divisions, stormtroopers and dive bombers. To make matters worse, Italy declared war, finally joining her Axis partner on the battlefront. Roosevelt proclaimed, in response to the Duce's actions, "The hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbour." Great Britain now stood alone in Europe, and Roosevelt resolved to lend what support he could to his transatlantic partner. "We will extend to the opponents of force the material resources of this nation." The president understood that a victorious Nazi Germany was a threat to US trade, but what he also found unnerving was the larger threat to democracy and the blind fanaticism with which so many Germans followed their Führer. Whatever his personal inclinations, the doves in US Congress ensured that military intervention was impossible at this stage, and that aid was the best Britain could hope for. But even before the election, Roosevelt had made efforts to prepare America for war. Throughout the summer of 1940, he had successfully steered both a naval expansion bill and Selective Service Act through Congress, thereby strengthening the US Navy, Army, and Air Force. By July, Roosevelt was even circumnavigating the Neutrality Acts, at great risk to his own political career. He agreed to the loan of 50 US World War I destroyers in return for 99-year leases on British military bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. His presidential opponent, Wendell Willkie, condemned the deal as the most arbitrary and dictatorial action ever taken by a president in the history of the United States.
I ask this Congress.
Roosevelt managed to replace the 1936 Neutrality Acts with an important revision that allowed the sale of material to belligerents as long as the recipients arranged for the transport using their own ships. This enabled Britain to buy US goods, so long as they were carried on British ships, hence the nickname cash and carry. The Act also exploited the fact that Germany had no funds and could not reliably ship across the British-controlled Atlantic Ocean. After his inauguration in March 1941, Roosevelt stepped up assistance to the Allies by persuading Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. Under its terms, the US could lend food, arms and supplies to any nation if it was deemed that the country's defense was necessary to the national security of America.
With aggressor nations.
In his own words, Roosevelt wanted to do everything we can do, short of war, to keep the British Isles afloat.
We shall send in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose and our pledge.
After Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the USSR, Lend-Lease was also extended to the Soviets. Roosevelt also gave war-making capabilities to Britain in the Atlantic and at the same time hindered the movements of German vessels. In April, the western half of the Atlantic was declared a neutral zone, enabling US ships to pass on information to the British. When German U-boats accidentally sank two American destroyers, the Greer and the Kearney, the President responded by ordering all German submarines to be sunk on sight. Congress then voted by a majority of 212 to 194 to repeal the Neutrality Acts and allow merchant shipping to be armed. Roosevelt justified this action with typical flamboyance. When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush it. On August 9, 1941, Churchill and Roosevelt met off the Newfoundland coast at Placentia Bay and agreed the basis of what would become the Atlantic Charter. Its ideals would embrace free trade, freedom of worship, and freedom of expression, and it would attempt to guard against secret agreements, the acquisition of territory, and the violation of the right to self-government of peoples. This meeting was significant, as it signaled a much firmer ideological alliance between Churchill and Roosevelt. For Churchill, it was a sure sign of Roosevelt's commitment to intervention. On his return, he informed a relieved British cabinet, "The President has said that he will wage war, but not declare it, and that he will become more and more provocative."
To our American friends and helpers, drawing ever closer in their might across the ocean. This is the message.
Historians have keenly debated Roosevelt's actions and goals in the run-up to open US involvement in World War II. Some believe that Roosevelt had no intention of fighting alongside Great Britain, and that the Lend-Lease Act was only offered in the strategic interests of the US. Indeed, after the basis of the Atlantic Charter had been agreed at Newfoundland, Roosevelt was quick to point out to the press upon his return, "There has been an interchange of views, that's all. The country is no closer to war." It has even been suggested that Roosevelt was exploiting Britain's situation in order to increase US power and influence throughout the world. Churchill was certainly despairing of Roosevelt's ruthlessness in the deal, having been forced to hand over British naval bases for the 50 elderly World War I destroyers. However, with the US Congress strongly opposed to war, it seems fairer to see the destroyer deal as a bid to appease the isolationist factions within the US government and wider society, especially in the midst of the election campaign. In any case, America was the so-called land of the free. For Roosevelt, why should a nation born by the very act of revolution against British imperialism be concerned about what he saw as an outmoded British Empire? Regardless of Roosevelt's true motives, the 50 destroyers undoubtedly helped Britain maintain her naval supremacy in the crucial Battle of the Atlantic, as did both the psychological and physical impact of Lend-Lease. An alternative view of Roosevelt's actions is that he was so concerned by the Nazi threat that he actively wanted to engage the US in war alongside Great Britain and, moreover, that he even risked his political career to do so. On May the 27th, 1940, he stated, "It is unmistakably apparent to all of us that unless the advance of Hitlerism is forcibly checked now, the Western Hemisphere will be in range of the Nazi weapons of destruction."
That the influence of America.
The fact that Roosevelt bypassed the Neutrality Acts in the midst of an election campaign is certainly strong evidence of his genuine commitment to helping the Allies. However, despite Roosevelt's tough rhetoric after the sinking of American shipping, he still made no effort to mobilize the nation for war. Indeed, when a third destroyer, the Reuben James, was sunk, there was no further action from Roosevelt, who even failed to break off diplomatic relations with Germany. It seems most plausible that Roosevelt's actions before US intervention were a genuine attempt to help Britain defeat the Nazis. Although not an act of pure altruism, a British victory conveniently dovetailed with US objectives in the wider world. The democratic political systems of the two countries were much closer to one another than to the recent European trend towards fascist dictatorships, and trade links with Britain were also strong. Moreover, the US economy was finally emerging from the Great Depression, and a Nazi victory could easily jeopardize the recovery process. However, Roosevelt probably did not want to risk military intervention in the war, but preferred to use aid in order to help finance Britain and Russia carry the burden of the fighting. Roosevelt exercised extreme caution in this regard. His initial refusal to allow US ships to be escorted by armed convoys suggests this. Rather than a belligerent nation, Roosevelt much preferred, as he himself put it, for America to be the great arsenal of democracy. This selfish motivation for American aid was not lost on Soviet soldiers at the front, who sarcastically dubbed the tins of Lend-Lease spam second fronts, in a cynical reference to the lack of any forthcoming military assistance.
For Roosevelt, it was a brilliant strategy of national and political self-interest. He was able to defend the US and oppose Hitler at almost no cost to American lives. The huge-scale arms production and supply to the Allies also provided a further badly needed boost to the US economy, and it was this that definitively lifted them out of the Depression. Also, fear engendered in the majority of Americans by the very real prospect of a Nazi victory meant that Roosevelt could offer this assistance without any real threat to his popularity at home. In fact, opinion polls revealed that Americans favoured assistance to Great Britain, even if it meant being dragged into the war. And one fortune poll showed that in 1942, an amazing 84% of Americans now favoured the previously unthinkable alliance with communist Russia.
The 7th of November 1941 changed everything. On that fateful morning, an event occurred that would transform not only the course of the war, but also of United States and world history. Roosevelt proclaimed this day would be a date which will live in infamy. This event is, of course, known to the world as Pearl Harbor. The attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike conducted by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The base was attacked by no fewer than 353 Japanese fighters, bombers and torpedo planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers. The damage to the US fleet was colossal. 8 US battleships, 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were sunk, and hundreds of planes were bombed as they lay helpless on the airfield. Over 2,000 American service personnel were also mortally wounded. The attack came as a profound shock to the American people and led directly to American entry into World War II in both the Pacific and European theaters. Rear Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet at the time of the Japanese attack, has largely been blamed for his gross dereliction of duty in failing to protect the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Many historians find it impossible to believe that the Japanese could have coordinated and carried out the plan without detection.
I read it hurriedly.
This disbelief has instigated many conspiracy theories, one of the most recent from Robert B. Stinnett, who asserts that the president circumvented US pacifism by deliberately inciting the assault on Pearl Harbor. Stinnett claims the Nazi German threat to the national security of the US prompted Roosevelt to find circuitous means to persuade an isolationist America to join the fight for freedom. He maintains that Roosevelt provoked Japan into the Pearl Harbor attack as a means to engage in the war in Europe and assist the allies of democracy. On the 27th of September 1940, Germany and her Axis partner Italy had signed a mutual assistance alliance with Japan that became known as the Tripartite Pact. This committed the 3 partners to assist each other in the event of attack. Stinnett believes this treaty provided America with the back door to war in Europe that was so desperately wanted. If Japan could be enticed into war, then the US would also automatically be engaged in a war against the Nazis. He points to evidence from a memorandum produced by Lieutenant Commander McCollum in October 1940, just 1 month after the signing of the Tripartite Pact. The document advocates 8 recommendations that appear to be designed explicitly to provoke the Japanese. More worryingly, these provocations were indeed put into effect by the US administration. They included keeping the US fleet based in Hawaiian waters, helping China in her fight against Japan in Manchuria, and a complete embargo on all sales of oil to Japan. Stinnett also claims that US cryptographers had decoded the vast majority of the Japanese Kaigan-Ango naval codes and were well aware of Japanese intelligence gathering activities at Pearl Harbor. Most controversially, he suggests that US authorities, including Roosevelt, knew an attack was imminent but chose to ignore it. This apparently unprovoked hostile aggression was the desired cataclysmic event that would prompt Congress to enact a declaration of war and mobilize unwavering support from US society. Stinnett's case against Roosevelt is convincing. Indeed, the very next day, Congress declared, with only one dissenting voice, that a state of war existed with Japan and 3 days later with Germany and Italy too.
Between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Former isolationist leaders dramatically changed allegiance overnight and now vocalized their support for war through the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Young American patriots were immediately ready to offer the ultimate sacrifice in the fight for that core American value, liberty. However, it was not guaranteed that war with Japan would necessarily lead to war with Italy and Germany. The reciprocal support that the tripartite agreement stipulated was subject to the specific circumstances of the aggression and was not totally binding. The Nazis themselves were hardly reliable allies. At the signing of the Rome-Berlin Axis, they had promised Italy to delay war until 1943. Moreover, their invasion of Russia made an absolute mockery of the Nazi-Soviet pact and revealed the extent of Hitler's treachery to the entire world. There was certainly no reason for Roosevelt or anybody else to believe that Germany would now honor the terms of the Tripartite Pact by declaring war on America in support of its ally Japan. Furthermore, Hitler was always overly cautious of attacking shipping in the Atlantic due to the risk of bringing the US into the war. He surely would have been less concerned had he been convinced that Japan would take up arms alongside him.
To provoke purposefully the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor was probably too big a risk for Roosevelt to take. It would have allowed for the destruction of the US Pacific Fleet without any firm guarantees of the desired outcome of involving America in a war against fascism in Europe. It is possible that the US authorities that had indeed cracked the majority of Japanese naval codes were aware of an impending attack from Japan, and it's even possible that they wanted to use this attack as a pretext for war. However, it's more likely that US political and military officials were so unprepared because they expected any attack to take place not at Pearl Harbor, but at US naval bases in the Philippines. The allegation that those officials would never have retaliated in order to maximize the impact on US society in mobilizing support for the war is highly improbable. Roosevelt would not have allowed for the sacrificing of military equipment or innocent American lives.
Roosevelt was a much-loved politician in America, not least for his creative endeavors to solve the economic depression of the 1930s. However, in the bleak winter of 1941, it was still uncertain how he would perform as Commander-in-Chief of the world's most potent military force. Nevertheless, his 8 years in office would ensure valuable experience in both managing Congress and mobilizing US society. Being paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair also meant that he was no stranger to overcoming great difficulties. In December 1941, Roosevelt's new priorities were revealed with the announcement that Dr. New Deal was handing his practice over to Dr. Win the War. Roosevelt set up the War Production Board in January 1942 and deserves much credit for America's unparalleled productive capacity throughout the course of World War II. American shipbuilding kept British supply lines open in the Atlantic despite the best efforts of German U-boats. This enabled the huge buildup of forces that was required in order for D-Day to take place. The 300,000 aeroplanes and 6 million tons of bombs produced were also essential. They allowed for the colossal damage inflicted by 24-hour Allied bombing of German cities. The dilapidating and demoralizing effect on the already war-weary Axis powers should not be underestimated. Roosevelt also set up the Office of War Mobilization in May 1943. This ensured 15 million American servicemen and women would help replace and reinforce Allied casualties at the front, although most of the burden of the fighting, as Stalin frequently reminded his allies, still fell upon the Soviets. It did not take long before America began to influence events on the battlefield. General Dwight D. Eisenhower led hugely successful Allied landings in North Africa at Oran, Algiers and Casablanca throughout 1942 and 1943. The success of Operation Torch led to the surrender of 250,000 Axis troops. The North African campaign also made possible control of the Suez Canal and the invasion of Italy through Sicily. US forces eventually took possession of Rome on the 4th of June 1944, but not without German military prowess taking its toll. It is estimated that between September 1943 and April 1945, some 60,000 Allied soldiers died in the fight for Italy. No longer could the US be accused of only paying for the war with money and weapons. The price for victory was now being paid at the much higher premium of young American lives. Despite the apparent success of the North African and Italian campaigns, no other issue fueled Stalin's anger and paranoia more than that of when, if ever, his so-called allies would open up a second front, not in the south of Europe, through Italy, but rather on the western side of the Nazi Empire, in France. This was crucial to Stalin, as it would force the Nazis to divide their forces and relieve the almost unbearable burden of the fighting weighing down on his Red Army. Anxious to keep the Russians on side, Roosevelt initially pledged to Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, that a second front could be established through France in 1942. However, huge logistical problems and military setbacks elsewhere meant that no second front would be opened that year. This brought accusations that the Allies appeared quite happy to sit back and allow their ideological arch-enemies, the Communists, to bear the brunt of the fighting. There may have been some truth in this. The Second Front was actively averted by Churchill, who preferred to attack what he, rather misleadingly, termed the soft underbelly of Europe, in the Adriatic and the Balkans, as opposed to the heavily defended French coast. This plan may well have been to keep Stalin out of the Balkans and to protect British imperial ambitions in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. This fact was not lost on either the security-obsessed Stalin or the anti-imperialist Roosevelt. In Cairo, Roosevelt teasingly remarked, "Winston, you have 400 years of acquisitive instinct in your blood, and you just don't understand how a country might not want to acquire land somewhere, even if they can get it. A new period has opened in the world's history, and you will have to adjust yourself to it." Roosevelt and Stalin preferred Operation Overlord, a cross-channel invasion of northern France. This was deemed a more viable solution, as it would force the Germans to fight and divide and face their enemies on two opposing fronts. The opening of the Second Front would also prevent Russia demanding too much territory after the war, which would be contrary to the principles set forth in the Atlantic Charter. The Second Front was delayed for 2 long years of bloodshed in the east and finally came on the 6th of June 1944 in what is commonly known as D-Day. The operation, executed by land, sea and air, was the largest amphibious invasion in world history. The landings took place along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, where Allied troops were met with fierce resistance from the awaiting German machine gunners and artillerymen. Once again, casualties were high. The delay in launching the Second Front undoubtedly increased tensions and suspicions among the Grand Alliance. However, it should not be forgotten that given how close the D-Day landings came to failure, an earlier attack might have been disastrous and could have delayed victory even longer. Roosevelt did agree with Stalin over many important issues, as he saw the value in maintaining positive relations with Soviet Russia, despite the huge political and personal gulf that existed between the two great leaders. He believed Stalin could help him rid the world of imperialism and thought he was the best-placed leader to nurture more liberal sentiments in the man of steel. Roosevelt believed that he had a close personal relationship with Uncle Joe and that he could exploit this friendship in the interests of peace. I think if I give Stalin everything I possibly can and ask for nothing from him in return, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of peace and democracy. In retrospect, this statement has been used to suggest that Roosevelt conceded too much to Stalin and turned a blind eye to his brutality. During the Warsaw Uprising throughout the summer of 1944, despite the close proximity of the Red Army, Stalin allowed the Polish resistance movement to be mercilessly crushed by the Nazis. He knew that the proud Poles would have defied any Soviet attempts to dominate the region with equal ferocity. Stalin even refused permission for British planes to refuel behind Soviet-occupied lines, thereby denying any aerial assistance to the Poles. Roosevelt would not concede to Churchill's suggestion that the president should join him in persuading Stalin to offer help to the Poles. I do not consider it advantageous to the long-range general war prospects for me to join with you in the proposed message to Uncle Joe. After 7 weeks, Stalin did eventually offer help to the Warsaw Rising, but only, rather conveniently, after the backbone of the resistance movement had been shattered. Roosevelt failed to see this flagrant opportunism from Stalin and preferred to believe it was a sign that he could still be negotiated with. Despite Roosevelt's optimism, he remained a pragmatist, and by the end of 1944, when the war had turned decidedly in favor of the Allies, he became less fearful of upsetting the man of steel. There had always been reservations about the granting of loans to the Soviets, not least because of their refusal to divulge military plans or act in concert with their allies. When the US administration suspected the Soviets of tailoring demands for the post-war economy, Lend-Lease began to be refused. Roosevelt remarked, "I think it is very important that we hold back and don't give any promise until we get what we want." Whatever Roosevelt's motives had been before US intervention, it was clear that 4 long years of fighting had dramatically transformed not just the military landscape, but also the political status quo. The wartime world situation was now unrecognizable from the early days of the war, when Nazi successes had appeared a certainty. By the time of the Yalta Conference in early February 1945, Roosevelt's major objectives had shifted. His overriding concerns by this stage were focused on how the post-war world would look and the ensuing peace agreements. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 had been a last major throw of the dice for the dwindling German forces. The offensive was launched through the densely forested Ardennes mountain region in Belgium. American forces were victorious, but it was the largest and bloodiest battle they had fought in World War II, and cost some 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. In the wake of the defeat, many experienced German units were left severely depleted of men and equipment as survivors either retreated or surrendered. In the war in the East, the Red Army, commanded by the brilliant Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was also thrusting towards Berlin. The westward march by Soviet forces was merciless and marked by brutality towards German civilians. Looting, burning, and rape were widespread. Under threat from all sides, it was clear that the Nazi regime was beginning to implode. All but Hitler and his most fanatical supporters now believed in the inevitability of German defeat, despite the best efforts of Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda machine. In the war in the Pacific, American and Allied forces were also faring well. In May 1942, the Battle of Coral Sea had stopped the rapid Japanese advance and secured Australian safety. The Battle of Midway Island the following month resulted in the sinking of 4 Japanese carriers and 300 planes and became a turning point in the US fortunes in the Pacific War. Since then, Admiral Chester Nimitz in the north and General Douglas MacArthur in the south had used superior air and naval power to island hop their way towards Japan. However, against a doggedly determined Japanese fighting force that often preferred death to dishonor, casualties remained high. Guadalcanal took 6 months to capture, and Iwo Jima cost 25,000 casualties. Okinawa had also proved difficult, with US forces up against Japanese kamikaze pilots that managed to sink no fewer than 30 US vessels. By the time of Yalta, it was estimated that Japanese defeat could take another 18 months and cost another 1 million lives. With such a potent enemy still to be overcome, Roosevelt felt it essential to maintain friendly relations with Stalin in the hope of securing Soviet entry into the war against Japan. This has added further fuel to the fire of criticism surrounding Roosevelt over his concessions to Stalin, especially at the expense of Poland. Roosevelt assured Stalin privately, "The United States will never lend its support in any way to any provisional government in Poland that would be inimical to your interests." Poland was a crucial item on the Soviet agenda at Yalta. Stalin stated that, for the Soviet government, the question of Poland was one of honor. But it was also a question of security. Poland had historically served as a corridor for forces attempting to invade Russia. The new boundaries of Poland were eventually agreed, as were the frontiers of the new and much smaller Germany. Stalin would get Polish territory, but in return, he promised free elections in Poland. However, in the interim, it was ominously agreed to reorganize the Communist Provisional Government of the Republic of Poland, set up by the Soviet Union, on a broader democratic basis. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was also agreed in the hope of maintaining free elections in all of the newly liberated lands. Poland was seen as important. As the largest of the Eastern European countries, it would set an important precedent about how new governments in other countries would follow. Roosevelt was generally happy with the agreements at Yalta, but was well aware that they had papered over the cracks in Poland. "I got everything I came for, and not at too high a price. The one nettlesome problem is Poland. The settlement we have in mind leaves much to be desired." His aide, Admiral William Leahy, was more direct in his assessment, proclaiming that the decisions reached were so elastic that the Russians can stretch it all the way from Yalta to Washington without ever technically breaking it. Despite the surface cordiality, Roosevelt had reason to be worried. Harriman, the US ambassador in Moscow, was already warning about Stalin establishing his brand of totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and of Soviet secret police activity in the occupied territories. Neither did there appear to be much preparation for the anticipated free elections in Poland. Another major priority for Roosevelt at Yalta was the need to establish a new international peacekeeping body. He believed the US, Britain, the Soviet Union and China would become the four policemen of the post-war world. If this vision of a lasting peace was to become a reality, the new United Nations organization would require greater cooperation and trust between the USSR and the capitalist powers. This apparent idealism, however, did not mean a lenient peace for the vanquished. On the contrary, Roosevelt demanded unconditional surrender and substantial territorial losses from Germany to compensate Poland. He also considered the dismemberment of Germany into small states, which did in effect occur through the four zones of occupation controlled by the Soviet Union, the US, Britain and France. The Henry Morgenthau plan to eliminate industry and turn Germany into a giant rural farming community was also seriously considered. Roosevelt's vision of peace undoubtedly had American interests at heart. Through the US zone of occupation, Roosevelt achieved his desire for an American presence in the center of Europe and thus a means to ensure American influence in the post-war world. Similarly, his insistence on the inclusion of China in the occupation of Japan would serve as a useful counterweight to Soviet dominance in Asia, especially after Japan's decline and military defeat. French involvement in occupied Germany and Austria was also intended to bridle Russian dominance in Europe. But Roosevelt genuinely desired greater cooperation with the USSR and wholeheartedly accounted for its inclusion in the new United Nations organization. He was even prepared to bargain against the ideals of the Atlantic Charter by negotiating a third way between self-determination for the Soviet-occupied countries of Eastern Europe and Stalin's need for security of his western borders. Cooperation with Communist Russia in the interests of global peace may paint the picture of Roosevelt as a magnanimous idealist, but in essence he was still the great pragmatist. He himself acknowledged this fact whilst remarking on negotiations with Russia, "It is permitted to walk with the devil until the bridge is crossed."
Roosevelt can be forgiven for his practical politics. He understood how vital the Soviets would be not only in the immediate war against Japan, but also to any meaningful post-war proposals for peace. He was concerned about Stalin's brutality and about the Red Army's occupation of Eastern Europe, but he felt that nothing short of a Third World War could prevent the Soviets dominating the region. The doctrine of liberated countries laid forth at Yalta, it was also hoped, may act as a restraining influence on Stalin, and he hoped that it would eventually relax control over the region and evolve more democratically. Roosevelt was fully aware that the Soviets were carrying the main burden of the war, and already deeply suspicious of their capitalist ally, not least because of the delayed Second Front. There was also the terrifying prospect that Stalin may try to pursue an independent peace with Hitler, or worse still, another secret deal. Some concessions simply needed to be offered to the communists.
On the 12th of April 1945, Roosevelt died, and sadly never lived to see the fruits of his achievements. The entire nation mourned the passing of the man and his lifetime of service to America. Roosevelt is still today revered as one of America's most popular presidents, both for his domestic and foreign policy achievements. Is this a valid appraisal of his contribution to history? Or is he simply a product of the times in which he lived, made famous by the enormity of events that took place under his presidency? Perhaps Roosevelt's most important contribution to history was his ability to hold the Grand Alliance together as a coordinated and unified fighting force. Not an easy task, given the domineering personalities, differing ideologies, and the mistrust between Churchill and Stalin. Roosevelt was also true to his word and remained a fervent anti-colonialist who undoubtedly helped to end the Age of Empire by working tirelessly to defend the liberty of nations at the end of World War II. Once again, these principles were in stark contrast not only to the views of Churchill, who was actually looking to bolster the British Empire with the recently liberated Axis territories, but also to some of his own advisors who suggested annexing the Philippines and the former Japanese-mandated islands. On the issue of colonialism, Roosevelt won, and indeed deserves, credit for such unwavering moral conviction. To stand firm against the doggedly determined Churchill and the elements of the US administration striving for easy colonial pickings was no easy task. Another great achievement and lasting legacy is his contribution to the foundation of the United Nations. Even if history judges Roosevelt to be a hawk due to his efforts to trigger US intervention in World War II, it must also conclude that he was most definitely a dove thereafter. Moreover, Roosevelt was skillfully able to gain public and political consensus for his proposals. The Senate voted 89-2 to accept the Charter for the UN and US membership, an incredible majority given the strength of isolationist sentiment in America before the war. Still, he is not without his critics, especially for his apparent tolerance of Stalin's brutality and the Red Army's Eastern European occupation. Some argue that Roosevelt should have listened to Churchill in his preference for a second front invasion of southern Europe through the Balkans as opposed to France. This would have limited the Red Army's encroachment in the region and possibly saved it from control by Moscow throughout the entire Cold War period. The Soviets were also denied involvement in the Italian negotiations with the newly formed Badoglio regime in Italy, set up after Mussolini's demise. This served as a powerful reminder to Stalin that whoever had military control in a region could exercise political control. Roosevelt must therefore accept some responsibility for the ruthless subjugation by Soviet Russia of 100 million Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, Romanians, Bulgarians, Hungarians and Germans for the near half-century following World War II. Roosevelt could also be blamed for his involvement in the Manhattan Project and America's development of the atomic bomb. Even though it was under President Truman's command that the bomb was eventually dropped, $2 billion had been spent in its development under the Roosevelt administration. It is unlikely that he would have refrained from using it if it had made victory more likely. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki 3 days later had a profound impact and severely damaging consequences, not just for the immediate victims of the blast. The secrecy surrounding the production of the bomb and the perceived unnecessary show of strength in its detonation provoked further insecurity and suspicion in communist Russia. The world's only communist state set about attempting to produce a bomb of equal, if not greater, power that could ensure its defense if necessary. The nuclear arms race between Soviet Russia and capitalist America followed, and lasted for a period of no fewer than 40 years, almost culminating in nuclear global destruction in the 1960s. This is perhaps Roosevelt's most pernicious legacy. That said, Roosevelt did work hard to please the Soviets and keep the Grand Alliance together. Soviet cooperation was integral to his vision for post-war peace and the new United Nations organization. Furthermore, Roosevelt's successor, President Truman, took an even tougher line on communism. It is safe to say that he cranked up ideological tensions to dangerous levels that Roosevelt would have desperately aimed to avoid. So, would the course of history have been different had Roosevelt lived longer? Certainly, when Roosevelt died, Stalin showed uncharacteristic sympathy for the departed, greeting the US ambassador in silence and holding his hand for 30 seconds. However, not even Roosevelt could have foreseen the Cold War or how he would have acted under this entirely new set of circumstances. As he himself acknowledged, "I am a juggler, and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does. I am quite happy to mislead and tell untruths if it will help to win the war." Roosevelt was a great pragmatist and leader in America's most challenging times. Both domestically and internationally, and in the fields of economics, politics and the military, Roosevelt rose to meet all challenges in spite of powerful political opponents, uneasy allies, formidable enemy nations, and even his own personal disability. It is for this reason that he personifies and encapsulates the spirit of the American dream. He is much loved by Americans now, as he was then, as America's longest-serving and perhaps greatest ever president.